Today, I would like to present the defense to my thesis project, Cross-Genre Composition, Encoding Characters in the Chamber Opera Ithaca with Semiotic Elements Derived from Commercial Music Genres from 2018. The thesis project consisted of two equally weighted components, the first of which is a new artistic product, which I define as being the score for a chamber opera Ithaca, so not the performance, the realization, but just the score itself as it is black and white on paper, and a written supplement, also black and white on paper, of discursive text of 371 pages. The artistic product articulates new artistic knowledge through the creation of the artistic experience itself. So the artistic experience speaks its own knowledge out. And the text articulates new artistic knowledge through discursive critical reflection on the artistic experience and on the creative process that led to it. Quickly, I will talk about the opera, although this presentation will focus on the text because the score and some excerpts of the performance of the opera are available online. Ithaca was developed through a concept of my own by Helmut Krause, setting Homer's The Odyssey in the digital realm, including the darknet, but also touching on themes such as internet surveillance and extreme content in the internet. It is 95 minutes long, approximately, for four singers, five instrumentalists, live electronics, and encapsulated in a 241-page score. The premiere was in April 2018 in the Hamburg State Opera, directed by Paul Georg Dietrich, conducted by Barbara Clare, and with dramaturgy by Johannes Blum. It was commissioned by the Klaus and Simon Stiftung and well received in media, local and national in Germany, the Hamburg Abendblatt, Deutschlandfunk, which is a German national radio station, papers Taz and O-Ton, as well as receiving the Rolf Maris Theater Prize for Outstanding Production and the Bach Prize Stipendium for the composition. Moving on to the dissertation text. Cross-genre composition, encoding characters in the chamber opera Ithaca with semiotic elements derived from commercial music genres. That is the topic. However, the research question is more simple. It is, how did I compose the chamber opera Ithaca? That seems to be a purely retrograde question, having done a free experiment that a construct was imposed upon it afterwards. However, at this point, I must say that before doing the artistic experiment, I set up a hypothesis and a line of questioning in the form of a project proposal for both the opera and the dissertation text, where I outlined my interest in what I called back then mixed genre composition. And then this text and this artistic product can be cross-referenced to this proposal for the course, which formed as a concrete starting point for the interests that were then explored. And that can be cross-referenced to create um, homogeneity and to uh, take away this purely retrogressive aspect of this question. The core components of exploring this research question are the score itself, a positioning, personally, definition and exploration of artistic research as I saw it at the time, the development of a compositional ideology cross-genre, and a method for analyzing the score according to cross-genre, which was original as well, and the analysis itself. So the journey and therefore the chronology of the text, and therefore this presentation will follow three main components: the score, and then the analysis of the score via the development of cross-genre. Those are the three elements of the presentation. Firstly, artistic research as a framework for the dissertation project. I posit artistic research as a paradigm shift in academia. I see it to be an innovative field of inquiry without broadly accepted practice. I think and I believe that the inclusion of artistic practice into a research practice excludes best practice because art in its nature is subversive and wants to exceed norms. Therefore, creating norms is impossible. The concept of a paradigm shift I based on Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he posits that the development of science through time is not accumulative in that it develops step by step following logical progressions based on that which came before necessarily, but can occur in paradigm shifts where explosively a new tectonic shift in creating knowledge occurs. And I believe artistic research to be one of these, including in its rejection of best practice. My definition of artistic research is as follows. It is a revolution, a new way of generating knowledge by making intuitive artistic processes more cognitive through critical reflection and articulating these results for posterity. This idea has been based on other authors. Um, but it is very important to me that the intuitive becomes cognitive and that it is articulated to others, not only through the artistic language, but through discursive text, which is the universal communicative means amongst humans. Christopher Freiling made a model which he called Practical Suggestions into Artistic Research, which had a three-part model. And that this idea of three parts has been for me very convincing. He talked about research into, through, and for art. This was built on by others frequently, not just myself, including Henk Borgdorf, which for me was the second big milestone in developing my perspective. The framework for research in this project, therefore, in the concepts into and through. Into art is the hermeneutic approach, interpreting art from some sort of distance. Even if it's my own art, I try to see it objectively through the lens of music analysis. That is what research into art is for me. And through art is that you research artistic knowledge through creating art itself. And so, therefore, into and through are contained in the score for Ithaca, because either I analyzed the score Ithaca in the case of into art, or I created knowledge by creating the score of Ithaca, which is through art. The other one is for art, which is sort of tool making and concept building, which can be used practically by myself to create future artistic work with confidence, efficiency, and effectiveness, or by other composers or music theorists who can take a music theoretical aspect of what I've done in my thesis and use it to create art themselves or to analyze art. The development of cross-genre composition, the compositional ideology behind Ithaca. I had intuitively created a model which I didn't claim to be true, but I claimed to be inspirational to me as an artist. And that model sees a bipolarity between opera houses and commercial music genres. This opened up pathways to adapting a theory by Boris Groys on the new, where he describes the appearance of newness in art through a process of bringing uncollected items into a museum. So a museum would have a defined set of artworks that they give as a definition of art, and that which is not in the museum is then not art for the purposes of that museum. How would this be, and how did I transfer it to mean in operatic composition in this context? I conceived an operatic space, which is my impressions of operatic repertoire, because we're talking about how did I compose the piece of music, therefore what's relevant is what did I see as opera at the time. And that was a defined set of impressions, experiences I had had, and scores that I had studied, and the content of these. And outside of these were sorts of external music, things that were not opera in quotation marks, so to say. One of these forms, conglomerates of external music, is genres, commercial music genres. Briefly, I defined it as those music genres that are gathered into commercial music charts, such as Spotify, or earlier one used Billboard charts. Although in the thesis I go into detail about what sort of content implications this has. There's a great article by Lena and Peterson which talks about the trajectories of genres and also that they are sets of constraints often built upon and hierarchies of musical constraints and foci built upon a sort of consensus between leading practitioners of each genre. That's a more sophisticated way of seeing it, but for the purposes of this short presentation, those in commercial music charts. This sort of model has been very um, interesting and important for me to develop. It is something I thought of intuitively and that inspired me intuitively, but having articulated it through this, I believe it's helped me create my art and it could help others. Therefore, I see it to be research for art. Of course, as an artist, often when you have two polarities that are supposed to have a wall between them, the first thing that you want to do is break down that wall, create hybridity, create exchange, transgress these barriers. And that's, of course, what it's all about for me. So the next thing I needed to have to build this ideology was a theory for hybridity and cultural exchange. For this, I looked to post-colonialism. I come from Australia myself, a post-colonial land, and Homi K. Bhabha's text, The Location of Culture, which I found very inspiring. It discusses hybridity and cultural exchange as occurring between two cultural spaces, creating a third space between where they interact and create a third new culture. What I liked about his theory is that it is very constructive. It looks to the future. It doesn't just focus on criticizing the past, or it doesn't primarily focus on cultural critique, such as maybe Said and the concept of otherness and exoticism, although Bhabha does talk about these concepts. And also Bhabha is a literary critic, so he is very involved in how art can be used or occurs, not only just can be used, but occurs in a third space sort of environment. What could this be in operatic composition? How did I translate it? I took my operatic space as musical culture A, musical culture B, in this case, commercial music genres, and in between, the third space is what I define as the musical creative process of the composer, how they conceive these two cultures coming together and creating something new. It's a creative process. That's the third space for me in operatic composition. Of course, that can also be used as research for art, but more specifically, this vocabulary is what I mean by research for art, where I took some terms, and it's also into is there, so that means that it also can be used to hermeneutically assess art from a perspective point, a vantage point. I took these terms from his texts, which for me were encapsulating what I wanted and what I felt was sufficient for this idea. These terms I then defined according to how I read them in Barber's texts. Barber doesn't necessarily define them clearly himself. He is a notoriously ambiguous writer. Um, but I define them how I read them in Barber. So enunciation is an expressive unit of translating and transvaluing cultural differences, for example. And then I made a sort of further transvaluation into the compositional realm. So taking again enunciation for him, and of course I've only just taken 4 examples here that I will use later in the presentation. So here, enunciation is the sort of smallest building block of third space for him. An expressive unit, closed in itself and complete, translating and transvaluing cultural differences. In composition, I saw this to be a musical cell that can't be broken down further, so to say, which contains both autonomous and associative material. Autonomous, I mean, is a more traditional thing of looking at um, techniques, harmonies, rhythms, whatever it may be. An associative material for me is a very subjective one. What associations do I have when I hear this music? What does it remind me of culturally? That for me was a very big breakthrough, and therefore an enunciation contains both of these. Hybridity is the mutual influence of two opposing cultures and their symbiotic creation of a third, according to Barber. And in composition, for me, enunciations simultaneously articulating elements of both musical spaces, mimicking both spaces, that is for me a hybrid, um, the concept of hybridity in this context. Fixity is the resistance towards hybridity through fixation on tradition, according to Barber. And in cross-genre composition, the resistance towards hybridity through fixation on one's own musical space, the space that the character represents. So this is going to be important for one of the characters I explore later in the opera in this presentation. And stereotype is a simplified presentation of the other as if free from internal difference, according to Barber, and according to cross-genre composition, an enunciation without internal difference. This list is, of course, non-exhaustive. One could create more terms, even find them from Barber or other authors, but for me, I really felt it was sufficient to then analyze the entire score of Ithaca, which is the research question. After this, I went on to develop an analytical method to take this Groys and this Barber, and how could that be used to analyze a work, Ithaca, hermeneutically, which is research into art, or how can it be used constructively for future compositions, either by myself or others, in a research for art manner. For me, I defined the purpose of musical analysis around the main research question, how did I compose the chamber opera Ithaca? According to Nicholas Cook, a prominent music theorist, who says that for him, music analysis is purely the question, how does it work? However that may be. Taking this as the foundation, I built on it according to David Beard and Kenneth Gloag, who in their Key Concepts of Musicology, a Routledge production, say, analysis provides a set of vocabularies or symbols, so there is this vocabulary from Barber, for the basic elements of music according to ideologically guided decisions. So this is cross-genre as a compositional ideology, which divide a musical structure into smaller constituent elements, one level, considered in isolation, as that's the bottom level, as small constituent elements of these enunciations, considered in isolation, so on their building block level, in relation to one another, in their mutual level, and in relation to the work as a whole, the meta level. Now, this three is for me can be put into a model for semiotic narrative analysis. I'll come to it very soon. And in order to analyze these three, I came across a model by Byron Almen about narrative archetypes, where he also has three layers, which is of course common in layered meaning in many other authors of semology, such as semiology, as those below. The bottom layer, according to Almen, is semantic characteristics. The mid layer is their mutual influence of these semantic characteristics, and the top is the cumulative global effect. We saw this in the quote from Beard and Gloag immediately before. Smaller constituent elements in isolation, bottom level, in relation to one another, the mutual influence, and in relation to the work as a whole, the cumulative global effect. What could this mean for cross-genre composition? The bottom layer, find the smallest coherent building blocks of Ithaca. Ithaca is a narrative opera built on the interaction of characters. So therefore, character is one sort of block that needs to be assessed, but the characters can be broke down into smaller elements, which are for me enunciations containing autonomous material, associations, cultural associations, and the process of hybridity, which is, as I said, the combination of um, these two spaces and the building blocks of cross-genre composition. The discovery of enunciations and this definition was for me a really big breakthrough. And this is something I hope, well, I carry with me even today. I'm making this recording in 2021, and I find highly inspiring. And I hope this is maybe one of the things that other people can take on from my research project. In order to analyze these enunciations, I came up with the following table where at the very top one lists which character identity, so which character in the opera, uh, breaks their music down into building blocks and numbers them on the left, then extracts the autonomous musical elements of each enunciation, the hermeneutic information, so what associations does the analyst or the composer have when listening to this material, and how is this part of a conflict in the third space. This is already looking on to their mutual influence, um, even in the bottom level in a very first step. Here's one example of the enunciation J7. Yuli is the main character, that is an adaptation of Ulysses and Odysseus. So she is the main protagonist representing Odysseus. And she has multiple enunciations. This one is her seventh enunciation. So I've said in scene 1.3 bars 120 to 122. Firstly, in the column, I look at the autonomous musical material, a leitmotif for Ithaca, a descending major seven and a rising perfect fifth, reinforced by modal tones in the accompaniment. In the middle column, what sort of associations do I have? Well, these intervals are actually very similar to another of her enunciations, J3, um, but the accompaniment and the modality of them, and especially, yeah, the direct repetition of these intervals, as you see Ithaca, Ithaca is there in Yuli's voice, is for me a romantic with a big R tonality. And I'll play the example soon so you can tell me if you also have associations of big R romantic music when you hear it. Because for me, her journey to Ithaca, she wants to reach home, reach Ithaca, is a romantic journey. She's longing to return home. This is a central tenet of Schubert and even Strauss. And so for me, it is a romantic thing. She idealizes the goal state. Those are my associations to this purely musical material, according to the operatic subgenre of romantic music. So then I see in the third one, I state that this enunciation strengthens the fact that Yuli is associated with the uh, contemporary classical music operatic space. So I would put Yuli in the opera house because of her material. This motif J7 is a romantic capital R, but for example, J3, which I mentioned, that is a very angular, very dissonant post-serial sort of language, but that is also an operatic language. So what I'm saying in this final column, especially if you compare it to the other enunciations, is that she represents the operatic space, but not stereotyped. She doesn't just do romantic music with a big R, that is at the bottom of the text, but she shows the internal cultural difference of the operatic space. The operatic space is not homogeneous completely. It's not one color. Therefore, she represents the operatic space in a non-stereotype way, but she has a sense of fixity in that she doesn't yet, and you'll see in the rest of the presentation, if she does that, she doesn't integrate these external genres into her language. So let's listen to this J7. It's up to you to judge if you have the same associations as me. The mid layer. The goal of the mid layer is to analyze the interaction of the characters. I looked for interaction in an article by Gregory Carl, Structuralism Musical Plot, where he takes the concept of binary semiotic conflict in music. Now I'm talking just about musical scores, and talks about plot functions of musical elements: enclosure, disruption, subversion, counteraction, realization, withdrawal, interruption. He also comes up with roles of musical material, protagonistic or villainous. I found this plot function list to be non-exhaustive, of course. People can come up with other terms, but sufficient. I didn't come up with other terms that I felt were necessarily there. But these roles, for me, were insufficient. Sorry, I've just made a little star there because this concept of binary semiotic conflict in music was, for me personally, a big revelation in the context of this cross-genre ideology I was coming up with these two spaces. So yes, these roles I found not sufficient. So I went on to research further and came across further terms in Story and Structure by Laurence Perrine, including anti-heroine, mentor, tempter, sidekick, skeptic, the emotional character, the logical character, the stock character. And he also talks character attributes, which I translated into the musical sphere as being character development. Development is a very music theoretical term. So you can have major or minor characters, and you can have dynamic or flat developments. Now I felt that the mid layer was sufficiently given symbols and vocabularies for me to discuss it, and I moved on. The following tables describe how I did that. The first one is talking about literary developments, about the libretto itself. I list the character identity: Yuli, Cyclops, Dark, etc. The role types and attributes. Um, is it a anti-heroine, a heroine, a villain, a protagonist, or whatever? And then why did I say that as such, and how does it develop? Is it a major or minor character? Is it a flat or a dynamic development? So that's that one. Now, just purely in music, so this is coming back to Carl, even just looking at the notes and the way they change the opera. Which character identity, which musical role, what are the reasons for this musical role, and how does the music develop in the scene? So this one became more verbose because I had to talk about music with words, and that's of course more verbose than if I can quote the words directly from the libretto. And then plot functions in the scene. So going bar by bar, how do they interact with each other? In these bars, which enunciations are there? Which musical plot type function are coming? And are there any other further comments on the libretto that reinforce the way this music is acting, the semiotics of this musical discourse? Here is one example. This is of a musical analysis of one of the characters, Der Kapitän. So this is not talking necessarily with the libretto in the main focus. This is talking about the musical content itself. Captain I defined as a villain. So, and the middle column, why is that? And it's because his language has an impact on Yuli. Yuli, usually when she's interacting with characters and she's being assertive and her language is dominating, so she was winning, so to say, she uses this J3 motive I talked about before, which is very angular, very syncopated, very dominant, very loud. But when she comes with Captain, especially in the bars 75 to 78, and she needs to say her name, which is of course a very personal thing. My Name ist Juli, my name is Juli. She uses this really fragile, introverted sort of enunciation, which I've called J4, which comes from an aria early on, that she usually only uses when she's alone and feeling vulnerable. But she uses this in interaction with the Capitaine. Therefore, and the Capitaine himself also has this sort of vulnerable, fragile, if not sick, sort of musical language. You might be able to see that I base it somewhat on grunge rock. Um, and so therefore, he is having an effect on Yuli, making her become more vulnerable, more fragile, more introverted. Whereas the general journey of Yuli is one as of a fighter for herself and a self-emanciator. And that is happening on a musical level. In the last final column on the right, I talk about his development of his character. So I say he has a sort of a bipolar shift between his K1 and K2 enunciations. Um, which say he's not a flat character. He does have different, very different developing sorts of language, but he's a minor character. He comes in one scene and his language is not seen in the broader opera. It's just in his one scene. This is the way Julie describes. So the singer obviously has a very powerful voice. She's a great singer, Lini Gong, but the music generally is a bit more fragile, I find, and it's up to you to interpret how you heard that music. I should have said it before, but that's this J3 motif. And as you may remember from just hearing it, it's very assertive, it's very aggressive, it's very powerful. That's how she responds to Cyclops, for example, who she defeats. So I hope you could keep those in mind, and I hope you can assess your associations based on what you heard compared to what I say. The top layer is to discover the overall cross-genre dramaturgy of Ithaca. Byron Almen was again a model for me, and he, based on the work of Liska and Fry, took a semiotic conflict and said there are four possible outcomes: romance, comedy, irony, or tragedy. That's based on where our sympathies lie and if the character that has our sympathies is successful or fails. The top two are if they are successful, and the bottom two are if they fail. In cross-genre opera, I'm just going to focus on the tragedy component because this was Ithaca, and I defined this archetype to be that a musical force is prevented from nurturing hybridity and cultural exchange by an opposing force of stereotype and fixity. So Yuli tries to, I'll go into the details exactly of what that is in a minute. And I assessed it through the following table, listing the musical elements representing order, in relation to cross-genre theory, the textual elements representing order, musical elements representing transgression, so that which fights against it, the order of the piece, whatever that may be, in relation to cross-genre theory, then in the text, and what are the musical elements eliciting the listener's sympathies in relation to cross-genre theory? Where is the listener in relation to this idea of inside and outside spaces? What does the listener want to occur? And I say it's hybridity, and then discussing the narrative archetype. Here it's going to be very concrete. The musical elements representing order in relation to cross-genre theory is that which is the operatic space. So Yuli's language based on contemporary classical music, i.e. J1, J3, and J8, and Yuli's language is based on quasi-late romantic classical music. That is, for me, my impressions of the operatic space, the mainstream of the operatic space, or just what attracts me is contemporary classical music and the high romantic tradition, and that is in Julie's language. The literary textual elements representing order, Yuli's journey to Ithaca. That is the big bow of the piece. What are musical elements representing transgression in relation to cross-genre theory? Well, the characters that are the external music genres, the commercial external music genres. For example, Cyclops' references to video game and computer sound design, that's non-operatic, that's trying to transgress this order. Cersei's musical reference to soul and R&B, soft jazz and techno, they try and transgress the musical order. We just heard Captain's grunge rock, etc. And of course, why these literary elements are representing transition in the text. So Cyclops and Yuli basically want to contain Yuli and basically misuse her for their own purposes. That for me is quite logical. So what are the results? What did I come up with? That was the method for analyzing it. What is in Ithaca? How did I compose Ithaca? The bottom layer. There are 7 characters breaking up into 36 enunciations. Those characters are as follows, with the number of enunciations they have. The autonomous musical material contained these sets of material, giving me these associations. So Yuli, um, as I've said, post-tonal and late romantic opera is for me what Yuli represents. Captain grunge rock, as well as chorale fragility. And the third space, their character identity, for example, in Yuli is clearly in the operatic museal-like space, yet containing internal difference, as a non-stereotyped culture has, according to Barber. And Captain is the hybrid between the outside space of grunge and the inside space of contemporary classical music and the choral technique, because as you will hear, I'll play some examples, he also builds in a grunge aesthetic, builds in um, elements of contemporary classical music, because in the piece, he basically is the ferryman over to the other side in the underworld where Odysseus is there. For those that are familiar with the book, so let's hear the captain's grunge rock influenced music, the sickness and monstrosity that I wanted to express, which is in the text because he's basically the bringer of death, so to say, and also that he is a complex character, a dynamic character, as I said before, which also hybridizes contemporary classical music. So here is an enunciation hybridizing contemporary classical music with grunge rock. So it's up to you to see. This is one of the enunciations I'm talking about. This is one of the main breakthroughs I had with this project. Is that a successful hybrid? What is your opinion? I'm not trying to say I've proved something to be successful or beautiful, but I'm trying to say in my project that I create keys for listening to the piece and assessing it yourself, informed with my perspective as a composer and with my intentions as a composer. That's basically what my thesis and my approach to artistic research is about. So I'd be very interested to hear any comments. This is Captain's second enunciation, what I'm going to play now, which is a chorale, which is a sort of a reference to classical music that Captain does, also expressing fragility.
Ich, Kapitän des Schiffes Esperanza, eines Schiffes ohne Segel, ohne Ruder, ohne Kessel und Motoren.
Characters and all enunciations, but for the purposes of this presentation, I focused on those. What is the mid layer of Ithaca? Well, there are these characters again, and these are the role types I defined with them according to the charts that I showed before, anti-heroine, villain, tempter, sidekick, and I gave reasons for this on the left, how it is in the text, and on the right, how it is in the music. You will see that they are basically the same, apart from Borgo, who I think created a more of a tempting role in the music than he did in the text, or he would mimic Yuli. That's also another one of Barber's vocabularies in order to try and bring Yuli over to his side. He's a very perverted character in the text and in the opera who basically creates snuff films, and he tries to get Yuli to do that with him. So that's one difference in the text. And in their development, if they're major or major or minor characters, and if they're flat or dynamic characters on the left in the text and the right in the music, they're also basically the same, apart from Dark is a flat character in the music where he is dynamic in the text, and that Captain is a dynamic character in the music where he is flat in the text. What is to be learnt about the semiology of Krauss's text and my music from this? Well, musical semiology largely reinforces the textual semiology. And a synthesis of Krauss's narrative with music was achieved along cross-genre lines, and this is another sort of result of my research for those looking for results at this stage of my research, through equating the bipolar conflict between Yuli and her surroundings in the text to a conflict between forces of enrichment in the music, so enrichment is hybridity and cultural exchange, cross-genre, and those of stereotype and fixity, which I define and Barber defines as being antithetical and opposing to enrichment. So this is the conclusion I came up with, that this was achieved in the text, answering the question, how did I compose the music based on cross-genre ideology? Exactly, how? And this, I would say, is largely research into art in that it is hermeneutically interpreting the score. The top layer of Ithaca, well, text and and music together, Yuli meets her demise through her inability to adapt to her surroundings. In the text, her fixation on reaching Ithaca blinds her from the fact that it doesn't exist. And in the music, her failure at enrichment of her character languages. So she doesn't enrich herself with Circe and Cyclops and Capitan and Borgo and Dark. She doesn't enrich herself. She keeps this fixity on her being in the operatic space. And it leads to a flat character dynamic. So I find that to be a tragedy, that this character, this person would have flourished, and the music would have flourished, and her language would have got stronger and more resilient and more beautiful. Would she take on influences from outside? And this you can think about, what would we all like the operatic tradition to be? We would like it to be, I believe, and this is a very ideological statement of mine, one that progresses into the future, that takes on influence from outside, which becomes more beautiful. We want museums full of more exquisite and more differentiated and diverse objects. We don't want to be stuck in the past. So I see Yuli in how she represents the operatic space to be flat and therefore a failure. This creates a tragic archetype where the fixity in Yuli's character defeats the goal of our sympathies, which is Yuli's character development through hybridity and cultural exchange. This is research into art. In summary, through models of artistic research, I learned about my creative process. This considered artistic. Yeah, exactly. This can. This part of this was the artistic experiment Ithaca, and the other part of this was analysis thereof using an originally designed method cross-genre composition. Artistic experiment was research through art, and the analysis was into as well as for art according to my model. Key realizations. The building blocks of my process are associations as they are married to musical material via the term enunciation. The main source of compositional inspiration is the consideration of newness regarding musical space, of operatic and of commercial music genres in this case. And these can be given a musical structure in an opera through creating a semiotic conflict between forces of hybridity and exchange and forces of stereotype and fixity that fight against each other, where the forces of hybridity and exchange are the de facto protagonists. So we want in our cross-genre thing um, concept for hybridity and exchange to win because as well as Barber, we see that as the healing process and a creative, beautiful process of culture against those that say stereotype and fixity, which say that the way we were in the past is the way we will always be, and the way they, the others, are and were in the past is the way they will always and other be. I see that as a villainous perspective. In opera, this conflict can be equated to a bipolar textual conflict in the given libretto to achieve functional synthesis of musical and textual narrative. And those are, according to artistic research, the parts of the model. These realizations may increase confidence, efficiency, and effectiveness for my own work and be used for third parties for theirs. Thank you very much for listening. Here is a bibliography of the authors I mentioned in this text. If you would like to read the entire thesis text, it is available online for free from the Volker Verlag. There is information, a link to that on my website, as is the score for Ithaca, which I've made available through a Creative Commons license. I thank you again for listening, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.